The magistrate slammed the seal into the parchment, and the chronicler felt the table shudder under his palm. Betrayal tightened his throat before he could move. The catalogue of names lay between them. The magistrate, 1 more year. The condemned heard the sound through iron bars and cursed once, low and hard. He recorded the date without lifting his head. The chronicler had recorded dates for a decade. He kept time in ink and ruled margins. He understood law. He understood ritual. He also understood that this sentence was not punishment that ended. It was punishment that wore someone down. That belief that the court had moved from justice into deliberate prolongation shaped his scribe's hand that night. The opening conflict arrived as sound, not thought. "Read it aloud," the condemned called through the grating. "Read it." He coughed on the word. "You will not break me." The magistrate did not answer. He patted the sealed ledger, then lifted his chin and said, "Order stands." The chronicler wrote the seal's impression, then copied the entry line by line. Within 5 sentences the stakes were clear. The court's central action was to extend the sentence by increments. The immediate problem. The condemned's time would lengthen without cause. The chronicler's problem. Whether to leave the ledger pristine or to mark the manipulations he had begun to suspect. He had a narrow choice. He chose the pen. They moved to the scribe's alcove, oil pooled on the candle dish. The chronicler turned the page and read the clauses aloud as his hand made identical letters. He kept his voice flat. He measured delay. Staggered hearings. Renewed seals as required. The condemned listened from the cell and made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. The chronicler's suspicion hardened into resolve. He tested a margin for a note and found the wax brittle where a previous entry had been erased. The first emotion shift arrived as doubt to anger. At first he doubted the pattern. He himself omissions were clerical error. Then he found the erased strokes. His hand trembled and he pressed too hard with the quill. He breathed and then forced his fingers steady. He copied the visible clause and then leaned closer to the outer ledger. He counted seals and compared dates. He whispered to himself, "There is intent here." That whisper moved him from doubt into anger. They enacted tightening measures the next day. The condemned returned to the cell and found his collar tightened by a craftsman's knot. Rations were reduced by a bowl. The guards refused to answer why. The chronicler watched the condemned test the rope's slack with a fingertip. The chronicler wrote, "Collar adjusted, ration cut by 1 portion. Shackles polished and shortened." He watched the condemned's jaw set. The condemned, "They plan to outlast me." The chronicler wrote the line and paused. A public reinforcement followed. The magistrate led a short hearing at the cell door. He explained the court's rationale in measured words. "We must maintain order," he said. "Order demands example." The condemned could not rise. He managed. "Order is what kills people slowly." The magistrate smiled without mirth. He lifted his hand and tapped the ledger. The chronicler recorded each phrase. The chronicler's empathy shifted from private pity to a concrete intent to protect names. He began carving small marks in his copy to index erased passages. The chronicler found the erased pages beneath a single candle 3 nights later. The wax had been scraped and smudged. Where words had been, thin scratches remained. He held the page to the light and saw indentations that spelled a list of dates and names. He traced the indents with a fingertip. He allowed, "These are missing." He went to the magistrate and put the page on the table. The magistrate set his glove over the marks and said, "Mistakes happen." The chronicler's voice did not shake. "These are deliberate," he said. A confrontation began with tidy sentences and then grew loud. Who erased them? The chronicler. Who ordered the omissions? The magistrate tilted his head. "The court adapts," he said. "Adaptation is law." The chronicler. "You erased names to lengthen sentences." The magistrate's fingernail scraped the ledger strap. "You presume motive," the chronicler answered. "I presume evidence." A guard moved a step forward. The condemned pressed his face to the bars and said, "Tell them, chronicler. Tell them." The chronicler left without a reply and kept the scraped page hidden beneath his copy. The next beat was ritualized delay and public procedure. The court staged new seals, scheduled hearings days apart, and required formal renewals. Each action arrived as a small, humiliating ritual. A clerk tapping a bell, a guard announcing a date, a magistrate signing in a careful script. The condemned had to stand and kneel and be read the same phrases on different days. Each repetition cost him a meal or sleep. The chronicler recorded every ceremony in full. He wrote the faces of officials. He noted the ledger numbers. He began to think of the punishment as crafted machinery rather than incidental cruelty. Another emotion shift pushed him from anger toward fear. In the corridor, a gaoler watched him too closely. The chronicler wrote with his left hand for a moment to throw the watcher off. He slipped a carved token into his palm and felt the grain of the wood. When he was alone, he thought of the token and felt dread press behind his throat. He must protect the record. He must also not be discovered. The fear showed in quick fingers and restless eyes. He chose a small act of rebellion. In the narrow corridor outside the ledger room, he wrote a marginal note on a duplicated page and folded it into a scrap that looked accidental. He tied the carved token to the scrap. At dusk, he slid both through a thin slot in the cell bars. The condemned felt the scrape of parchment and the cool of the token. He opened the scrap and read the names inked in the chronicler's precise hand. You did this, the chronicler answered. I did what I could, the condemned. Now someone will know the chronicler could not guarantee safety. He could guarantee witness. The shift from fear moved toward resolve. The condemned took the scrap and pressed it to his chest. He folded his hands and counted the names aloud, not as memory but as a list he refused to lose. The chronicler watched the condemned measure breath and time. The condemned whispered, "They will not erase these from me." The chronicler had never seen someone gather their survival from paper before. He felt something like relief and something like dread at how fragile words could be. Then came the climb to the climax. The condemned, emboldened by the hidden list, timed an attempt. During an evening when the magistrate departed for a chapel ritual, the condemned forced open the bars with a stolen nail and crawled toward the ledger room. He moved slow and low. The chronicler kept his watch near the archive table and saw the slate of a hand at the latch. He heard a scrape and then a soft curse. He rose. He met the condemned halfway in the guttering light. The chronicler pushed the stash forward and whispered, "Take it." The condemned took the sealed ledger with both hands and lunged back into the corridor. The struggle erupted at the archive table beneath the council candle. This is the chapter's peak. The magistrate had returned early. He caught the movement in the doorway and ran forward. "Stop!" he shouted. The condemned set the ledger on the table and pulled at the strap. The chronicler shoved his shoulder against the magistrate to buy time. The magistrate slammed his iron ring onto the wood and struck the table. The strap tore, ink spilled over, dates. The condemned shouted, "Look!" The chronicler shoved pages toward the light. Names showed where the cruelties had been hidden. Dialogue became a rapid clash. "You touch the court's ledger and you break the law." The magistrate barked. The condemned, "You break people." The magistrate, "You defy procedure." The chronicler, "You erased their time." The magistrate lunged. The condemned swung the ledger. The chronicler pulled the ledger away and slapped it open. "Read it." The chronicler insisted, read these dates. The magistrate swore and grabbed the edge of the page. "Seize him," he ordered. A guard tried to lay hands on the condemned. The condemned twisted free and shoved the ledger up so the candle caught the ink. He yelled, "Names! Names!" The chronicler read names aloud. The back and forth lasted seconds that felt like minutes. There were 6 sharp lines of exchange where the 3 voices collided. "Read it." The chronicler read the erased entries. The condemned urged, "You presume evidence." The magistrate snapped, "These are records." The chronicler, "These are omissions." The condemned, "You will be held to account." The chronicler, "Account." The magistrate cried. The guard tightened his grip. The chronicler felt the leather strap of the ledger cut into his palm. A sudden, unexpected reveal changed how they understood earlier events. Beneath the scraped margins, the chronicler found a second set of names in a different hand. The handwriting matched a clerk who had once whispered to the magistrate and later vanished from public records. The chronicler recognized the clerk's flourish. This hand belongs to Varro. Varro's name is in the margin." The magistrate's face went pale under candlelight. He stammered, "Varro served order." "Varro kept lists," the condemned spat, "so Varro erased them for you." The room tilted around that new fact. The revelation tied a missing person to the omissions, and it turned the magistrate's general defense into a personal decision. The physical struggle finished in a small, fierce aftermath. The magistrate reasserted formal control with a measured hand. He wrapped the ledger in oilcloth, slid it into straps, and replaced the seal with deliberate care. The court will correct what must be corrected. The condemned lay against the wall and breathed hard. He had blood on his knuckles. The chronicler pressed his palm to the table and felt the damp ink. He had cut his hand on a torn page and ignored the sting. He had preserved certain names. He had also ensured he had witnesses. The final beat was quiet and procedural. The magistrate ordered the ledger resealed and the page closed. He read a short statement aloud and added a stamped amendment that maintained public authority. The chronicler wrote an oblique epilogue on the back of a spare folio. A list of the erased names and a note that the ledger had been tampered with. He signed with his small mark and slid the folio into his private copy. The condemned sat up and touched the carved token at his neck. They will know now. The chapter closed on a concrete situational beat. The chronicler closed the ledger, slid the sealed page back into the straps, and left the corridor with the token in his palm. He did not promise safety. He had preserved testimony, and he had exposed a hand that had tried to fake the law. The condemned lay back and counted the carved names on the token. The magistrate watched them both and wrote a new entry into his private book, a formal correction that would never reach the public rolls. The corridor smelled of tallow and old paper. The chronicler walked out into the dawn, light, and kept his head down. Emotion roots and shifts threaded the whole night. Betrayal began the scene and pushed the chronicler from doubt to anger, from anger to fear, and finally toward a grim resolve. He used short actions, slips of paper, a carved token, a torn page, to move events. The confrontation in the archive served as the chapter's climax and resolved the immediate conflict. The erased entries were exposed and names survived in his hand. The final paragraphs close on specific consequences, not proclamations. The magistrate's correction remains private. The condemned's body is broken, but a preserved testimony exists. The chronicler has traded a quiet, legal career for a record that may cost him everything. Outside the compound, a bell rang for morning prayer. The chronicler tucked the folio into his vest and walked toward the steps where a messenger waited. The messenger handed him a sealed note and said, "The court wants your list catalogue." The chronicler folded the note and slipped it into his palm with the carved token. He had turned pages into weapons and names into witnesses. He had acted because he could not stand the methodical attrition of a human life. He had no illusions about what would come next. He only had ink, a memory of Varro's hand, and the ledger's exposed margins. He lit his candle for one last moment and reread his marginal note. He tightened the quill between his fingers and left the archive. He walked past the cell, and the condemned's eyes followed him until the corridor swallowed the light. The chronicler kept walking until his shadow joined the crowd in the pale street. The carved token remained in his palm like a small, solid promise of names he could not unmake. A thin slip of sealed parchment slid through iron bars and landed on cold stone. The condemned stared at the black wax and the new date stamped in cramped ink, and slapped the paper with a rough palm. Betrayal sat between the metal and the paper. The chronicler felt it the way a sudden chill moves through a room. He leaned forward, ink-stained fingers tightening on his notebook, and read the extension twice to make sure the letters had not been misread. The immediate conflict was visible and raw. The guard left the hatch open only a breath, then closed it when the sound of the condemned's curse hit the corridor. The chronicler murmured, read it aloud, and pushed the slip through the opening so the ledger could be heard by record. The condemned read, 1 more year. The audience met the concrete stakes in that moment. Another year under chain, another year measured in hunger and ritualized delay. The chronicler had seen a seal slammed months before, when the magistrate had pressed it into the ledger, and the table had shuddered under his palm. He remembered the memory exactly, paper fibers, the metallic scent of the ring, the way the magistrate's throat tightened, and the recollection tightened his jaw now. The hook folded into the first hours of the night. The condemned struck the bars once, hard enough to make the iron sing. "You keep stamping my life away," he shouted. "You call this justice?" The guard stepped in and grabbed his shoulder. The chronicler stepped back and took out his quill. The opening minutes established who they were and what the problem would be. A sentence designed to stretch hope thin, enforced by an authority that used procedure as a blade. The chronicler's work was simple in name and corrosive in effect. He recorded dates, not motives. That night, suspicion hardened into labor. He set his notebook on his knee and watched the condemned, looking for changes to record and for any small detail that might prove a pattern. The corridor smelled of stale straw and exercise of authority. The guard's boots thudded against the flagstone. The chronicler wrote the new date and a marginal note. Extension delivered by officer, no signature. He tapped the quill against the wooden rim and listened. The condemned folded his hands around his knees and stared past the small circle of light the hatch allowed. The magistrate signed this. The chronicler. The guard shrugged. A clerk brought it. Said the seal was authorized. Name the clerk. The chronicler. The guard frowned. You don't need names. You have the order. The chronicler's hand paused over the paper. He felt the first emotion shift. Suspicion gave way to a plan. He needed records, hard, dated marks that would show the prior erasures he had noticed in the archives. He remembered the ledger shaking the last time the magistrate pressed wax. He remembered that the magistrate had said, "1 more year," with the same tight mouth. That memory from the table became a line he could follow. They moved into the corridor. The condemned's outburst had already thinned to a low mutter. He spat into the straw and said, "1 more year. 1 more year." They buy time with the paper. The chronicler watched him. The man had once learned trades. Now his fingers were raw from rope and cold. Do not count it aloud. The chronicler, keep those numbers small. Keep them for your head. The condemned laughed, a dry sound. "You write what you want," he said. "Write that they took my name." They parted with a brief look. The chronicler pressed his palm to the page and closed the hatch. He kept the slip between 2 fingers until the guards had turned away, then slid it into his vest. That physical act, hiding the new date against his chest, was the most direct refusal he could manage without open confrontation. The second emotion shift arrived. Hope, brief and brittle, when he felt possession of the paper. Morning found the magistrate in his private chamber with a ledger open and a small note penciled in the margin. The chronicler stood by the door and watched the magistrate press wax into aged paper. The magistrate did not look up. He moved with a precision that suggested ritual, not hurry. "You watched the exchange last night?" The magistrate, without turning. "I recorded it," the chronicler replied. "Records are thin things. They can be corrected." The chronicler's voice did not rise. "Corrections must be noted." The magistrate tapped his ring against the table and said, "Bring me the intake registers. We will reconcile them." The chronicler folded his hands and felt nausea. He had already seen reconciling before, erasures, scraped ink, a careful hand that left no trace. He walked out toward the archive alcove and found a clerk there. The clerk's fingers were stained with old ink. He avoided eye contact. "The ledger doesn't match the intake registers." The chronicler. The clerk's lip thinned. "Those are private records. I only want to compare dates." The chronicler. "Show me the columns where entries were removed." They bent over the narrow alcove and spread papers under a single candle. The chronicler traced lines with a fingertip and found the erased column. Ink had been scraped away and the paper had been retouched. He lifted the ledger and glanced along the edge. A line of faint numbers reappeared when he tilted the candle just so. "There are gaps." The chronicler. The clerk's hands trembled. They are to leave blanks when a sentence is extended. By whom? The chronicler. The magistrate. The clerk said. The chronicler closed his eyes for the fraction of a moment and felt anger settle like rust in his throat. He wrote down the erased entries in careful, short strokes. The third external event arrived, discovery. Someone else in the tower might notice. Someone else might hide it again. He took the copied fragment and compared it to the slip he had kept. The dates matched. The scraped numbers fit the pattern. He put the fragment in his notebook and wiped his fingers on his sleeve. That evening, in the council ante-room, the chronicler confronted the magistrate. The room smelled of oiled wood and candle wax. The magistrate folded a document with the same exacting motion he used to press seals. There are deliberate gaps. The chronicler, on numerous files. The ledger has been altered to show delays. The magistrate looked at him and said, "Delays are a tool of governance. This is not governance." The chronicler. "This is punishment designed to stretch past hope. You speak boldly." Chronicler. The magistrate answered, "You speak as though you were judge." He paused and set the paper down. Order must be shown to survive, who benefits from survival that requires hollowing a man out year by year. The chronicler. The magistrate's fingers flexed on the table. It is not for you to decide. His tone was precise and cold. The chronicler felt fear press behind his sternum. He kept his voice even. If I present proof, will you correct it? The magistrate's eyes narrowed. Proof can be interpreted. They traded 3 short sentences like blows. The magistrate produced an argument with the air of law. The chronicler returned records with the force of evidence. The confrontation included 6 rapid lines of dialogue, each snapping back and forth, and both men held their ground. The chronicler left with a strained mouth and a ledger in his hands. The next beat came in the archive alcove again. The chronicler and the clerk compared the official ledger to intake registers, and the clerk showed him where the digits had been smoothed away. The chronicler. If I copied this to the condemned, he could show it in court. The clerk breathed hard and then whispered, I will help you copy the page. Not here, not where the magistrate watches. Meet me at dusk by the visitation hatch. That night the chronicler waited. He watched the condemned through the hatch and saw how the man's hands shook when the chronicler passed the folded fragment through a sliver of opening. The condemned's fingers closed on the paper with a force that made his knuckles white. The magistrate lied. The condemned, you will make him answer. Maybe. The chronicler, maybe the truth will make him answer. They spoke in short lines. The condemned's voice rose and fell. Do not let them take it from me. The chronicler nodded once. This exchange reignited hope. The chronicler felt a brief lightness. Hope that records in other hands could be used to force a public reckoning. He folded his hands around his quill and prepared what he would do next. But the magistrate learned of the transfer. He arranged a public sealing in the great hall and ordered attendance where the hall could see the ritual. The condemned was brought before the dais in shackles, and the chronicler was made to stand where witnesses could mark his actions. The hall's floor was polished and cold. Torches lined the pillars. The magistrate stepped forward and pressed wax into the ledger in front of assembled officials. He spoke with measured cadence. The court extends this sentence by lawful procedure, he declared. The chronicler stepped forward and produced the copied ledger. He spoke, voice steady. These entries were erased. The record shows deliberate delay. He walked toward the dais and held the fragment up. The magistrate's face tightened. You challenge me, he demanded. I challenge the record. The chronicler. The magistrate's reply was immediate. Seize the chronicler. Bind the condemned. Silence the witness. Guards moved with exact choreography and cut off the chronicler's path. The hall saw the chronicler shoved to the floor, the chronicler's quill skittering away across polished stone. The condemned screamed and was dragged back toward the holding area. At the peak, the chapter's climax, the chronicler had time for one action. He slipped the original ledger fragment into the condemned's palm as the guards closed in. The movement was small, a single motion, but precise. Someone had to carry proof beyond the magistrate's sight. The courtroom scene delivered its required intensity with rapid exchanges and physical confrontation. The magistrate's authority manifested in the tightening of his jaw and the clang of iron rings. The chronicler's fear hardened into a choice. Preserve the document or preserve his own freedom. He chose the document. They dragged the chronicler to a small cell beyond the hall. They bound his wrists but left him conscious. A guard leaned close and said, You should have kept your place. The chronicler held his breath. He had already placed the ledger fragment into the condemned's palm. The man still had it. The chronicler felt dread press down and then a small, stubborn warmth, the knowledge that the fragment existed somewhere beyond the magistrate's immediate control. In the hallway outside the cells, the condemned held the fragment beneath his torn sleeve. He traced the scraped numbers with a fingertip. The clerk helped you. He asked the chronicler when the two locked eyes through bars. Yes, the chronicler copied it. Then there is paper that says otherwise, the condemned. We will use it. The chronicler watched the magistrate step back to his ledger. The magistrate pressed his thumb along a margin, watching the seal set. He counted minutes with a fingertip on the table, as he had always done. The chronicler's final paragraphs in the chapter would be small actions and concrete decisions rather than reflection. They had resolved the small conflict. The proof moved from the chronicler into the condemned's possession. The chronicler's notebook contained copies. The clerk had risked himself. The magistrate had shown his teeth. Those facts closed the chapter's immediate arc without pretending the larger war was over. The chronicler, left in a narrow cell with cold stone pressing at his back, set his quill on the floor and began a new entry. He wrote the magistrate's exact words from the hall. He wrote the time, the witnesses, and the action. He wrote the day the magistrate ordered the public sealing and the moment the guards were commanded to seize him. The condemned, in his corner of the holding area, counted the dates on the fragment by touch. He kept his thumb over the scraped numbers and let his mouth form thin words. One day at a time, he said aloud to himself, not to hope but as a measure. The chronicler scratched a final note. Vitter will meet me at dawn to carry copies beyond the river. If he fails, the ledger remains in the condemned's possession. In the last concrete beat, someone knocked at the outer door of the cell. The chronicler looked up. A messenger slipped a small, folded note under the gate. The chronicler read 3 words and felt the next move taking shape. He closed his notebook and held the page against his palm. The ledger's fragment rested elsewhere, but the deed had been done. The chamber noises continued. The magistrate counting, the guards shifting, the condemned breathing under chains. The knock at the gate sounded again, and the chronicler reached for the paper at his breast. The chapter ended with the sound and with the paper in his hand for a moment longer before he tucked it away, sharp and real, like a promise against the dark. Emotion root, betrayal, 2 clear emotion shifts, suspicion to hope, hope to fear, and then resolve. The chronicler began suspicious, found reason to hope when he kept the sealed slip, and then moved to fear after the public seizure, choosing to preserve the evidence at personal cost. The events of this chapter resolve the immediate confrontation, proof moved, the chronicler detained, and the condemned left with a hidden ledger, and end on a concrete action. A knock at the cell door and a folded note that demands the next step. He shoved the sealed parchment through the bars at dusk and left the wax to cool on the stone. The magistrate's gloved hand retreated before the condemned could close his fingers on the paper. Betrayal tightened in the chronicler's chest as he watched the seal set. That feeling made him move before reason could argue. The condemned spat against the bars, voice rough and raw. "Magistrate," he said, "you promised a date." The magistrate did not look up. "The court amends," he answered, and his voice cut the corridor. The chronicler had felt the table shudder when the magistrate first pressed his seal weeks before. He had felt it under his palm in the council chamber when names were catalogued. He remembered the authority in that blow and the way papers creaked like small doors closing. Now the magistrate repeated the ritual in public near the cell block, and the chronicler recognized the motion for what it was. Not a step toward closure, but a pattern of postponement. He moved closer and kept his hands empty, fingers stained with ink as testimony. The corridor smelled of damp stone and candle wax. A thin band of light fell across the condemned's face and showed the pale scars that marked his jaw. The condemned grabbed at the decree with one hand, and then let it fall when the jailer stepped forward. He had no proof to seize it, and the jailer had orders. The chronicler watched the way the condemned's jaw set and then loosened. Anger became a visible muscle, then a tired acceptance. The chronicler's mouth hardened. He counted details while the magistrate turned away. The wax, the ring's dent, the cramped ink of the added claws. Each detail was a hinge. They had already used paper as a weapon. In the first ledger, the magistrate had driven the seal into parchment at the council table. The chronicler had felt that strike through the wood and known the moment the court made a decision that would be read like a sentence. In the second ledger, a thin slip had slid through iron bars and landed on the stone, an action the condemned had answered with a curse. Those were not memories as much as repeated demonstrations. Tonight the magistrate performed a new one. The condemned spat again and pressed his palms flat to the bars. "You promised release," he said to the corridor. "You promised a day." The jailer folded his hands and did not answer. A guard nudged a torch to better show the seal. The magistrate watched the torch and did not speak. The chronicler felt an emotion shift. The first betrayal hardened into a cold, deliberate anger when he read the added clause with his eyes. Then, as the magistrate walked away, the anger slid into a slow, deep despair. The chronicler recognized that despair in the hollow of the condemned's eyes. He waited until the magistrate's footsteps faded down the stone stairs, then stepped up to the bars and asked one measured question. "What does the clause say?" The condemned looked at him. "It says nothing I can touch," he said. "It says years." The chronicler held the paper by its bottom edge without touching the wax seal. Ink blurred into the fibers where the magistrate had scrawled an elaborate postponement. He read the language aloud in a low voice, as if testing it against the corridor's air. Its terms turned a promise into a map of delays, a sequence of hearings, discretion left to unnamed officers, and provisions contingent on impossible conditions. The chronicler's hands trembled, but his words stayed steady. He retreated to the scribal alcove and set the decree beside his ledger. His pulse beat in his throat. Betrayal pushed him to scrutinize the paper for more than legal phrasing. He saw the same cramped hand he had seen the night the seal sank into the council table, and he saw marginal numbers added after the fact. He copied the amendment into his book with slow, exact strokes. Each letter he wrote was an act of resistance. Each curl of ink an attempt to fix truth where official truth might be altered. Hours later, near midnight, the chronicler worked by the single candle in the alcove. He had paused twice to listen, once when a distant voice argued in the court above, once when boots moved on the gallery stairs. He tapped his quill between thoughts and did not run his fingers across the wet ink. Outside, a thin wind struck the shutters and the jailer patted the corridor's stones as if testing them for cracks. The chronicler copied the clause into his ledger and circled the phrase that turned release into an indefinite expectation. He wrote dates he had not been given and then struck them out, because the court had struck them out on its official page. He remembered when the condemned first cursed the thin slip of parchment. That was a night he thought the law might finally break for a man. The magistrate had offered procedure in the place of mercy before. The chronicler had recorded it and noted the reactions. Now the chronicler understood a new pattern. The magistrate did not deny the need to punish. He denied closure. The chronicler felt an emotion shift from anger to a stubborn clarity. He would preserve a copy. The condemned pressed his face against the bars at one point, whispering names that had been listed in the earlier ledger. "Remember the names," he murmured. "Remember Thomas and Mira and the others," the names plainly, and that plainness made the chronicler lift his pen. The chronicler wrote the names into a margin and then, without pause, cradled the carved token the condemned had given him earlier and hid it inside the book's spine. He felt the token like a beating thing under his palm. That small act made his decision feel less secret and more necessary. In the archive beneath the court, the chronicler later compared copies. He laid the official ledger beside his own entries and found blank spaces where names once had been. Entire dates had been scrubbed and overwritten with new language. The clerk, a man named Havel, worked beside him and looked up with a dry mouth. They left holes deliberately. Havel, they left space to put in whatever time they want. The chronicler's hands went cold. He Havel to read aloud, and Havel did, voice low and clipped. Clause of indefinite reprieve. Havel read, extension at the discretion of the court's appointed officer. The chronicler watched the clerk's fingers trace the blank area, and thought of how easily a blank becomes an instrument. The chronicler took the ledger to the council chamber at pre-dawn. He carried the book under his arm and kept his voice steady when he spoke. "Magistrate," he said, "you have erased names to insert delay." The magistrate's face remained square and measured. "The court preserves order," he answered. "My actions are within our prerogative." The chronicler placed the official page on the table and then the censored copy beside it. "Havel saw it," he said. "I copied it myself." The magistrate ran a gloved fingertip where ink had been smudged. "You should not make false charges, chronicler," he said. "You should not interfere with the court's discretion." They traded rapid lines like the tapping of cues. The magistrate's voice stayed in a practiced rhythm. "You claim erasure. Provide proof." The chronicler pushed the ledger forward. "I provide it now," he said. "Havel will testify." "Havel is a clerk," the magistrate returned. "Clerks are chronicler. This council corrects errors." "You overreach." The chronicler's jaw clenched. "You corrected the ledger to put off release," he said. "You changed names to stretch sentences." You call that order? The magistrate stood and leaned over the table. Order matters more than a single life, chronicler, he said. Do you not understand? If we allow exceptions, chaos follows, discipline decays. Institutions fail. The chronicler tapped the ledger as if sealing an argument. You use institutions to hide cruelty, he said. You will not hide what was written here. The magistrate's pupils narrowed. You will preserve your copy as you please, but you will not spread lies. The chronicler's throat tightened. He felt a second shift in emotion. Clarity bent into fear, then edged back to resolve. He had to choose whether to act openly or to preserve the truth in secret. The choice burned in him until dawn blurred into pale gray. He chose secrecy. He met the condemned in the transfer chamber beneath the court just before the final sealing. The chamber smelled of wet straw and iron. Guards waited like measured punctuation. The magistrate stood with his signet ring catching candlelight and the ledger strapped at his side. The chronicler had placed a single folded sheet inside his tunic. Inside that sheet was the true record and the token from the condemned. The magistrate announced the clause, and then opened the ledger to the spot where the official text lay. He stamped the wax. The sound carried like a small bell. The condemned lurched forward as if the ledger were a door he could shove open. He grabbed at the page. No! The condemned roared. You cannot. Guards closed on him. A physical struggle began. The condemned fought with the raw desperation of a man who had had the horizon taken from him. He pulled at the page with both hands while the magistrate gripped the ledger, and a guard twisted the condemned's arm. The chronicler moved into the scuffle, trying first to speak, then to separate bodies. Stop! Stop! He shouted. The magistrate barked an order and struck the chronicler's shoulder with the flat of his hand. The ledger slammed down. The seal met wax once more. The magistrate's voice was thin with command. This decree is final, he said. 3 guards held the condemned while he thrashed. He bit a guard's hand and spat blood. You promised a day, he gasped. You promised a day. The chronicler tried to reach the ledger. The magistrate blocked him with the ringed hand. Papers slid, leather creaked, and the seal set against the sealed clause as the finality of the moment closed. The struggle became a chorus of grunts and the metallic scrape of cuffs. The chronicler felt his own fingers go numb from the pressure of his pen. When the pushing stopped, the condemned lay panting on the floor. A guard took his elbow and hauled him upright. The chronicler stepped back and felt something in his chest split between shame and relief. The magistrate looked at him with narrow eyes and then at the guards. Take him to isolation, the magistrate. Take him where the court's orders will be kept. The chronicler watched the condemned go. He watched the carved token slip out from somewhere and clatter to the stone. A guard kicked it away. They dragged the condemned down the corridor into deeper cells, past iron doors the chronicler had only seen from a distance. The chronicler tried to speak to the jailer. What ward? He asked. The jailer would not answer. The chronicler followed as far as he could before a guard barred his path. The chronicler felt the space between himself and the condemned enlarge like a wound. Back in the archive beneath the court, the chronicler worked in secret. He copied critical pages into a hidden folio. He wrote names in the margins and dated them. He folded the true sheet and slid the carved token into the spine of his ledger where it would not be found by routine inspections. He wrapped the book in oilcloth and then in a false ledger cover with bland handwriting to disguise it. The chronicler chose the small alcove behind the archive, narrow, unused, and lined with dust, for the hiding place. He pressed the folio into a crevice and tapped the stone twice to mark it. He had an unexpected reveal then. Havel, the clerk, had followed him. Havel's face looked exhausted and guilty. I couldn't leave it, Havel, they me to alter the page. I did it because I feared the magistrate. I cannot watch it be used this way. The chronicler looked at Havel and heard a new voice in the ledger's small rebellion. Tell me everything you saw. The chronicler. Havel named dates, officers, and the times when ink had been scraped away and overwritten. The chronicler wrote while Havel spoke. This exchange rewired everything. The magistrate's actions were not mere legal adjustments, but coordinated manipulations with clerical cooperation. They argued quietly about next steps. We can present this openly. Havel suggested, we can take it to another table, to the council. You speak of exposing the magistrate. The chronicler answered, he will call you a liar and strip your office. You will lose more than a ledger. Havel's hands trembled. What then? He asked. The chronicler did not answer at once. He thought of the condemned's face in the transfer chamber, of the tokens sliding on stone. He chose to keep the copy hidden and to preserve witnesses in the archive. He needed more names, more corroboration, and a path that would not allow the magistrate to silence them all at once. The chronicler moved with a new plan. He would let the public record remain corrupted for a time but build a parallel record in secret. He arranged meetings with other clerks and with a jailer named Corin who owed him a favor. Corin agreed to whisper where the condemned had been taken and to leave a mark on the outer ring of the cell door the chronicler could track. The chronicler recorded Corin's direction, a ward deeper than the usual isolation, one with ritualized restraints and limited visitation. The new information changed the immediate stakes. The condemned's contact would be reduced to nothing, and any hope of public appeal would fade. At dawn, the chronicler returned to the transfer chamber and found the magistrate gone. The ledger sat on the table closed and heavy. Guards stood by. The chronicler himself, the truth out loud. The magistrate had won the day's confrontation, but he had not won everything. The chronicler had the hidden copy. Havel had his testimony. Corin had the ward's name. He breathed in shallowly and let his anger settle into a focused industry. He would methodically place evidence where those who cared enough would find it. 2 days later, the chronicler placed a small note inside a shipment of official rolls that would be carried to a neighboring clerk in another district. The note contained a single line of instruction and a place to look in the ledger's margin. He routed it through Havel, who had agreed to make the exchange under the guise of routine paperwork. The chronicler felt an odd mixture of fear and purpose. The first emotion had been betrayal, then anger, then despair, and now a cold resolve that moved through his limbs like a practiced step. He had shifted emotional ground twice, from betrayal to anger, then from anger to secret resolve. That afternoon an unexpected storm cracked the sky as if the city itself tested the secrecy of papers. Rain hammered the prison's eaves and filtered into the courtyard. A guard rushed a soaked bundle into the archive and cursed. Corin slipped the outer ring mark into the ledger as planned and left a folded scrap beside it. The chronicler accepted the scrap and read the carved word. Ward 11, he wrote the name into his hidden folio and then sealed the folio within the oilcloth. The act felt small but real, a preserved path to the condemned. News traveled in small, deliberate motions. A merchant's boy delivered a rumor that another court clerk had found a mismatched seal in an unrelated will. The chronicler noted the coincidence and filed it beside his notes. Havel brought a timid visitor, a woman whose brother had been listed and then removed. She pressed her palms together and whispered names. The chronicler took down what she said. Each person who came offered a thread. The chronicler began to braid them into a record that would not be easily dismissed. The final twist arrived unexpectedly. The magistrate, certain in his victory, had allowed a public ceremony to reassert the court's authority. He would have the ledger displayed in the Great Hall. The chronicler learned of the ceremony from a junior guard who had had his conscience pricked by the earlier scuffle. The guard, Thomas, told the chronicler where and when the ledger would be shown. He will show the seal as final. Thomas, he will show how the law stands. The chronicler saw an opportunity. The ledger on display would be the official page, but the magistrate would rely on the appearance of permanence to drown the buried truth. That night the chronicler and Havel moved. They did not attempt to steal the official ledger. Instead, they arranged for a public clerk in the hall to receive a separate bundle containing a copy of the hidden folio under the pretense of routine record exchange. Havel read aloud the corrected names in the council chamber while the magistrate sat among dignitaries and the populace. The public clerk paled when the names matched those the chronicler had hidden. A murmur rose. The magistrate's face tightened, but he had already staged the seal. He could not, without inviting chaos, arrest every clerk present. The magistrate stood and spoke in calm, measured phrases. "The court upholds its decisions," he said. The chronicler stepped forward and read the specific passages that had been erased in the official ledger, presenting dates and witness names. Havel backed him, voice steady now. The crowd leaned forward. Some stared at the magistrate's ring, others at the official ledger on the dais. The magistrate's mouth tightened. He looked at the chronicler and then at the assembling witnesses. The moment did not resolve into the violent overturn the chronicler had once imagined. Instead, the magistrate used his authority to threaten a legal purge of the clerks. He pointed at Havel. "You will be investigated for falsifying records," he said. Havel trembled. The chronicler felt his stomach drop. He had misjudged how the magistrate would respond to exposure. The clerk's face went pale and then, abruptly, he found his voice. "I did not falsify, Havel. I followed orders to alter, yes, but I will testify to the orders." The magistrate argued back with the same litany of institutional necessity. The crowd muttered. The magistrate could not immediately strike down all witnesses without exposing his own mechanics. The chronicler had secured small wins. The hidden copy circulated to trusted hands, the carved token sat in his ledger, Havel had borne witness, and Corin had marked the ward. Still, the condemned had been moved and the magistrate's seal remained in place. The chronicler realized the chapter's end would not be a tidy reversal but a sustained resistance. He organized a plan to send the hidden folio beyond the city, to a judge known for independence. He arranged, through a merchant contact, to have a sealed roll carried to the neighboring district where a sympathetic magistrate might force a public inquiry. The final scene of the day locked itself into a single, concrete act. The chronicler slid the oilcloth, wrapped folio into a hollow of the archive stone where he had placed the carved token. He tapped the stone twice to mark the place and then snapped the ledger closed. The archive smelled of ink and wet straw. He heard distant footsteps and then the dull creak of the court doors as business resumed above. The chronicler stepped out into the corridor and met the jailer at the bars. "He is taken," the jailer said. "Ward 11. The chronicler nodded and pressed his hand flat across the bars where the condemned's palm had been. He felt the faint oil where the carving had left a smear. "I will find him," he said. The jailer lowered his head and did not speak. The chronicler turned away and walked towards the steps that led up to the city. He kept his shoulders squared. He had transferred the truth into places beyond immediate reach. He had not yet righted wrongs. He had arranged the instruments of a later reckoning. When the corridor emptied, the chronicler stroked his ink-stained fingertips and catalogued the night's outcomes. The magistrate had sealed the clause and forced the condemned into deeper isolation. The chronicler had hidden the true ledger and secured witnesses. Havel had acknowledged the alterations. Corin had supplied the ward name. Thomas had given the time of display. The carved token rested where it would remain until a proper hand retrieved it. The chronicler let his breath out in a long, measured line and then folded his hands around his knees as if counting days. Outside, the first grey light of morning thinned the shadows, but did not erase the sense that some mechanics of cruelty had been set in motion. The chronicler understood that the immediate danger, public erasure of names, the magistrate's legal smokescreens, had been checked only partially. He had arranged for the ledger's truth to survive beyond a single hand. He had traded a frontal challenge for a network of small, concrete moves. Copies placed in other clerks' hands, testimony secured, the carved token hidden, and a merchant wrote prepared. The condemned's struggle had been met with both brute force and bureaucratic cunning. The magistrate's victory at the table had been countersigned by the chronicler's secrecy. The chapter closed on a concrete, unfolding beat. The chronicler slid his hidden folio into the hollow and tapped the stone. That single knock repeated the old rhythm, 1, 2. The carved token shifted slightly inside the spine and then settled. A guard's footsteps echoed above. The chronicler looked down the corridor toward the place where the magistrate's seal had been set, then turned and walked up the stairs in a steady, purposeful stride. He carried with him the knowledge of where the condemned had gone, the names that had been removed, and the copy of the ledger that would not be erased by a single ringed hand. The final sound before the door closed was the faint scrape of leather as the magistrate's ledger was returned to the chest in the council chamber. The chronicler kept his own copy hidden and left the court to its public performance, knowing that he had preserved the truth where the official record tried to bury it.